Hi, I'm Lindsay,
And I'm Renee.
and we are both doctoral students at the University of South Florida in the clinical psychology program there.
We both work in a clinical lab where we study at-risk youth, and we also study the processes involved in how therapy works with children and their families.
So we first wanted to just give you an overview of how we got into psychology and what we want to use, how we want to use it in our ultimate careers.
Basically, throughout high school, I wanted to be an obstetrician, and I wanted to be in the helping professions, and I did some kind of internship throughout high school, and I realized that I really can't stand the sight of blood. So medical school is out of the question. In college, I still wanted to help people, so I went into psychology as a major. And while I was doing my undergrad, I volunteered in different labs because I really didn't know what the different types of psychology were. I worked in a memory lab, I worked in a work psychology lab, and I finally ended up in a clinical lab that worked with at-risk youth. And I pretty much kind of see myself long-term as being a professor at a university in a clinical psychology program.
Well, I have a pretty similar final outcome goal as Renee, but my interest in psychology started when I kind of as a whim took the AP psychology class in high school, and I was interested in the concepts we talked about. So in college, I wasn't a psychology major to begin with, but I was taking some psychology classes and they were fascinating. And then the classes start getting harder. As some of you, if you're in college already, you might be realizing that there's research methods and statistics and things. And I think at that point, as they were getting harder, I really liked the science aspect of psychology, and I liked that it was a blend of understanding real world interactions, but also using such scientific methods. And I think that a big thing was kind of looking around and saying, wow, I'm getting A's in these classes. Maybe this is something I'm good at. So now my goal is to also be a professor at a university, and I want to make sure that I'm able to blend all three aspects of teaching, doing research, and also seeing clients in a clinical setting. So I'm sure you can imagine that there's quite a lot of coursework involved in the psychology major and psychology in graduate school. Some of the courses are more theoretical and some of them are more research focused. So this would involve things like family therapy, couples therapy, intelligence testing, developmental processes, qualitative research methods, multivariate statistics, and so on. Some of your classes are a little bit more applied, so they might be called practicum or externship, and those are things where you're going out into a clinical setting and you're using the skills that you've learned in the other clinically focused classes and applying them to working with clients. You have a supervisor, but you're getting to have some face-to-face time with clients. So the one that I really appreciated was when I was working at a boys' home or a group home for adolescents who had somehow committed an offense. Sort of like juvenile delinquents, but it wasn't that extreme of a crime, and I got to do a lot of group therapy, psychoeducational programming, and that kind of things, and I enjoyed that experience.
One of my favorite classes that we've had so far is neuropsychological assessment. And what was interesting about how this class was set up was the first half of the semester we learned about the foundations and how to give neuropsychological assessments, what the theory was, how this can actually help clients. And then we got to actually do these assessments with clients that were referred from the neurology department at our university. So I actually got to take what I had learned and work with a client in person, and I learned as I went, and I was supervised, and I got feedback immediately from my supervisor, so I got to kind of see, I got to use what I'd learned in a very applied way, and I think that some of those classes are probably my favorite when they have both of those aspects.
And you mentioned earlier that there's always going to be research involved in a doctoral program. So there's two big research projects that you've probably heard about. There's a master's thesis and a doctoral dissertation. And both of those, the student, we, are in charge of the study from start to finish. So that involves doing the background literature review, reading about what's out there already in your area, then starting to plan your own study, and recruiting participants, running participants, analyzing the data, interpreting your data, and then reporting about it in a journal article perhaps, or at a presentation at a conference. So those are very involved research studies, but you learn a lot from doing it. So my favorite part about psychology is the fact that we get to study how people think, how people learn, how people interact with one another, how they cope with emotions. And then we get to figure out, why do we care? And use that information to share it and disseminate that knowledge with a lot of different areas in our society. So understanding how people interact is applicable in social interaction. So it's interesting for understanding how kids learn to deal with their peers. But then it's also applicable in business settings. So how do you get your employees to interact well with each other and with their customers? And then we learn about how people think and how people learn, which is applicable to, obviously, psychology, but also education or parenting. So I like that our studies and the knowledge that we learn and study is applicable to so many domains.
And I think my favorite part about clinical psychology is the potential of the impact I can have on an entire community or an entire country or world. I do research in a laboratory that will hopefully be picked up by other therapists and clinicians who are actually using it with clients every day. So it's potentially something that I've been working on for a few years in a lab could be used by thousands of other people and be helping a lot of people. So that's a huge impact for, for what I'm doing in the lab. However, I have to say that one of the hardest parts about this degree is the fact that we have to wear many hats. In one day, in the morning, we may be students taking our graduate classes. By the afternoon, we're teaching an undergraduate class, so we're the teacher. And maybe late afternoon, we're actually seeing clients, so we're a therapist. And that's all in one day.
And then you go home and you're working on your dissertation.
Yes, so and that doesn't even include all of the personal roles you may play throughout your life. These are just the professional ones. It's kind of hard to switch automatically between those roles throughout the day and still be performing at your best, because they each require kind of different skill sets. So that's kind of hard. We're kind of expected to do well in all these different domains in clinical psychology. So when I applied to graduate school, there were certainly some things I wish I had known beforehand that I think would have made it a little easier, made me a more competitive applicant. Something that they don't really tell you is there's a lot that you have to do in addition to getting your 4-year degree in psychology to actually get into a graduate program. And those aren't really listed in any book. It's kind of, you learn this information by talking to professors and talking to graduate students. Let's see, in my 4 years, I went to a professor's office hours. I asked them questions. How do I get a recommendation letter? What is grad school like in clinical psychology? What is grad school like in cognitive psychology? What would I be doing day to day? And I really couldn't have found that information anywhere before I had, asked somebody.
Yeah, and nowadays, there are some books that say, how do you get into graduate school? And then probably the number one thing that they're going to say is to get research experience. And I remember some of my professors, probably like yours, told you to get as much research experience as you could. Well, unfortunately, I went to a small liberal arts school, and only maybe 2 of the professors were doing their own research. So I looked around in the community, and there was a larger university, that was more research focused, and I found an opportunity for myself to get involved as a volunteer in their research lab, doing something in a lab that I thought was really interesting. So you're gaining that experience of what is research really like, how do you enter data, what are people really doing that's research, and that's valuable both so you can learn, but also on paper. It's really important.
Yes, and to add on to that, this whole concept of doing research before you get into grad school does have many purposes to it. It's going to get you in contact with professors so you can actually have a talking relationship and have a mentor, and have them advise you about how to get into grad school, what to do to study for the GREs, which is a whole other test you have to take to get into grad school. And then it's also for yourself. Before you make a decision to spend 5 to 7 years in additional schooling, do you like research? Are you good at it? Could you see yourself doing this for the next 5 to 6 years? And without testing out the waters through undergrad, I really wouldn't have known that I enjoy this. I certainly didn't like the idea of doing research because I didn't know what it meant until I'd actually experienced it. I would say that you can get your 4-year degree in psychology and never do any of these additional things, and you still have your degree, but you're not going to be a competitive applicant to get into a doctoral program. And I think that's something that we want to stress, are the students that go on to get letters of recommendation from professors to get into a master's or a doctoral program are the ones that went above and beyond what the minimum requirements were in their classes.
I know you also got some volunteer experiences outside of research.
I did. Before I really kind of embraced the idea of doing research, I thought I wanted to spend most of my time as a clinician. So I went and got experience doing clinical work, and I worked at a rape crisis center as a volunteer for about 2 years. It was intense, and it was a great learning experience, and I realized that I had more questions. I had things I wanted to find out. How do I make this system work better? And I kind of realized that instead of a clinical perspective, maybe I'd do better as a researcher researching this population and crisis centers. So that was kind of an interesting change to see how that experience influenced my later choices.
Something that I wish I had done more of prior to my last years of college and my graduate school experience is focused a little bit more on how I study. How do I learn best? Because for many people who are thinking about graduate school, maybe school has been easy for you. And I remember it was for me, and I don't think I could have pinpointed what I was actually doing to study for tests. But then as the material gets harder, you have to figure out new ways of actually interacting with the material that you're learning in a course. So not just rereading a textbook, not just making flashcards, but really trying to write about it or talk about it to other people is what worked for me.
Like going home and telling your parents or telling your brothers and sisters what you learned in class, like this new interesting psychological theory. And sometimes I recommend that to the students I teach. That's how you know if you really understand a concept. Can you go home and tell someone about it in a coherent way?
Yeah, because the material that you're learning in graduate school is going to be much more difficult than what's been thrown at you in high school or college. And that studying techniques is also going to be extremely important while studying for the GRE. And the GRE matters. Your score on that is probably the first thing someone's going to look at in the cutoff point of who gets into a graduate school program. And yes, it's just a number, but it's a very important number. The second related concept to that is managing your time. So that's not just with managing your time for studying, it's managing your time between courses. It's managing your time between volunteer experiences and doing things that are fun to you and doing schoolwork. And the time management is really important to your success in graduate school and being able to achieve all the goals you set out for yourself.
That actually just reminded me of a really good point, was when I decided to get that clinical experience at the crisis center, I realized that the training was so intense, I could not take a full load of coursework and do that. And I made the choice to take a semester off to get this clinical experience. And that was kind of a big time management. I'm not going to graduate in the 4 years that was intended. And that was a choice I made, and I think it really paid off because it was a valuable learning experience.
Mm-hmm.